Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are submerging into a fascinating strategic analysis, one originally penned in the early 1980s, that really captures a fundamental shift in South Asian defense and foreign policy.
We are. We're exploring the Indian Ocean, a body of water that's so vast, so critical to global commerce, yet for decades, one of its primary littoral states, Pakistan, treated it as, well, a total afterthought.
And that's the paradox we're dissecting today, isn't it?
It is. Our mission here is to understand Pakistan's profound strategic pivot. I mean, for the first 2 decades after partition and independence, the nation's entire defense apparatus was focused almost exclusively on vulnerability across its land borders.
Right. The sea was just a secondary, a low-priority concern.
A very low priority concern. But the sources we have, they clearly show that by the early 1980s, policymakers didn't just recognize the ocean's importance. They believed that the power arrangements in the Indian Ocean would ultimately, and this is a quote, seal the land problem.
Okay, let's unpack this monumental reevaluation, because this isn't just about, buying a few new ships.
No, not at all.
This is a total philosophical overhaul of the national security doctrine. So what forced this pivot? We are looking at a confluence of shocks. The strategic vacuum left by the British, the frantic rush of superpower rivalry, the U.S. and the Soviet Union.
India's aggressive naval expansion.
In the sudden, acute recognition of maritime economic security needs. We need to go granular here, moving beyond the simple narrative of India got stronger, to understand why the Indian Ocean became an undeniable strategic crucible almost overnight.
To really appreciate the scale of that strategic shift, we first have to grasp the scale of the theater itself. The Indian Ocean is massive. It's the third largest ocean globally. We're talking about roughly 73.6 million square kilometers.
That's just gargantuan. To give you a mental image, it's larger than the entire Mediterranean and the Caribbean combined. And it's not contained. It's a nexus point touching 3 major continents: Australia, Asia, and Africa.
Exactly. And the complexity, it really stems from this geography. I mean, we're talking about no fewer than 40 littoral and hinterland states bordering or depending on this single body of water.
40.
Which makes the internal power dynamics incredibly complicated, and that's even before the global powers arrive on the scene.
If we look back historically, what really stands out is that for centuries, despite the rise and fall of great indigenous empires in the region, the Mughals, the Marathas, none of them were ever able to establish consistent singular dominance over the Indian Ocean itself.
And the sources explain that was often a logistical failure. While these empires absolutely dominated their river valleys and land masses, they just lacked the naval technology, or I guess the sustained strategic will to project power across the vast distances of the ocean.
The pattern of singular control only really emerged when the Europeans arrived.
Right, you had the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the French all competing for a time.
But the true period of singular control, the period that defined the security expectations of the entire region, was when the British consolidated their position toward the end of the 18th century.
For about 150 years, the Indian Ocean was viewed and treated as a British lake. This single, cohesive naval dominance dictated the entire security architecture of the region.
Which is a crucial factor when we discuss Pakistan's initial policy later, isn't it? I mean, why worry about the sea when your primary ally basically owns it?
Precisely. However, this dominance started crumbling with the logistical strains of World War II and was effectively over by the 1950s and 60s. It was driven by decolonization and Britain's gradual but systematic reduction of its commitments east of the Suez.
And the moment that singular power recedes, you're left with this enormous body of water bordered by 40 states, all marked by immense diversity and profound power disparity.
That heterogeneity is a constant source of tension. You have states with significant resources, economic heft, a reasonable military, and the strategic will to project influence. You think Australia, Indonesia, and critically for our story, India, they see themselves as potential regional players.
And then you have the other end of the spectrum.
Yeah.
States that are weak, poor, and strategically very vulnerable. Countries like Botswana, which is a hinterland state, Lesotho, the Maldives, Oman, and Swaziland.
And the sources, they really highlight that this massive gap, this socioeconomic and political disparity, it naturally fuels jealousies, localized rivalries, and it contributes directly to military confrontations. The strong feel entitled to dominate, the weak feel perpetually threatened.
If the political geography isn't complicated enough, let's talk about the economic stakes, because that's what truly globalizes the ocean's importance.
Well, the Indian Ocean region is incredibly rich in raw materials like gold, tin, manganese, and nickel. It also supplies essential agricultural products, including natural rubber, tea, and wool.
But the single greatest economic factor, the one that makes the industrialized world pay very close attention, is the oil lifeline. We cannot overstate this.
No, you can't. The Persian Gulf holds the lion's share of the world's known petroleum reserves.
And this oil is transported almost exclusively via the Indian Ocean. It flows out to North America, to Europe, Japan, and to the burgeoning third world economies. The safety of that supply line is just not negotiable for global commerce.
And here's where it gets really interesting and why the strategic dimension sharpened so quickly: the 1973-74 energy crisis.
That wasn't just a political moment, it was an economic shock that demonstrated utter global dependence on those sea lanes.
Exactly. That crisis, driven by the oil embargo and the subsequent quadrupling of crude oil prices, it gave a new, sharp, undeniable strategic dimension to the region's importance for the entire industrialized world.
I mean, a disruption in these sea lanes doesn't just inconvenience, it means catastrophic economic dislocation for a large portion of mankind. The realization dawned. Protecting the oil flow was paramount, and that necessitated a permanent military presence.
And it wasn't just about the known wealth. That crisis spurred the urgency to find new wealth within the ocean itself.
Right, new resources.
Exactly. The oil embargo and the price hike underlined the potential for future resources: seabed minerals, vast fisheries, and, of course, the urgency of finding offshore oil. This pushed the littoral states toward the idea of asserting control over their maritime economic zones, realizing they needed a strong international regime to protect these emerging resource rights.
We'll definitely discuss the exclusive economic zone, the EEZ, later, but its urgency was clearly born here.
Absolutely. Then finally, there's the immense human factor, which acts as a kind of geopolitical magnet for external powers.
You mean the population?
Nearly 1 billion people live in the littoral states. This makes the region crucial for superpowers seeking to ensure friendly or at least non-hostile regimes. Influence in this area translates directly to votes in the UN and access to resources and military bases. This simple desire for influence inevitably draws these nations directly into global power politics, transforming what was a regional concern into a global stage for proxy competition.
Okay, so that is the massive, complex, and vulnerable theater. Now we have to turn to Pakistan's historical stance. Given the scale of the Indian Ocean, how could any coastal nation, especially one involved in such acute regional rivalries, demonstrate only a peripheral interest, assigning the Indian Ocean such a low priority for 2 whole decades?
Well, it was entirely a function of perceived existential threat. For Pakistan's early defense and foreign policy planners, the nation's territorial integrity was challenged almost exclusively across the land frontiers.
The Indo-Pakistan border and the Pak-Afghan border.
Exactly. The greatest, most terrifying scenario for them was the possibility of a simultaneous two-front armed conflict on both of those land borders.
And if the threat is existential and immediate on land, your resources will always follow that threat. So Pakistan's strategy became overwhelmingly land-oriented. It was all about building a strong army and air force.
And that land focus was reinforced by a painful history of disputes right from partition. You had the immediate communal and Hindu-Muslim riots, the massive refugee problem that strained the new state's resources to the breaking point.
And then the disputes over the division of assets and military stores from British India.
Right, and then you get to the core intractable political flashpoints that really define the relationship.
The Kashmir dispute, of course.
Kashmir, of course, but also disputes over Junagadh and Hyderabad, and the crucial canal water dispute, which was an economic life or death issue for Pakistan. India's unilateral suspension of trade further cemented the view that any economic strangulation would come via land.
So this history, it created a massive, and you could say justified, sense of mutual distrust.
It led to the concentration of Indian troops in the Punjab sector, and it culminated in 3 early wars: 1948-49, April 1965, and September 1965. This constant high-tension state meant the army was always the priority.
And this anxiety wasn't just isolated to the east. The Afghan factor simultaneously locked down that land focus in the west.
The strained relations with Afghanistan revolved around the demands for Pashtunistan, which covered variable claims on Pakistan's northwest frontier province and parts of Baluchistan. The demands fluctuated, sometimes outright incorporation into Afghanistan, sometimes an independent Pathan state, sometimes just maximum autonomy.
And relations were so tense that diplomatic ties were severed twice, and war was narrowly averted on multiple occasions.
So if you were worried about an attack from the east and an attack from the west simultaneously, you are naturally going to invest 90% of your resources in ground defense. It just makes strategic sense at the time.
And on top of that modern necessity, you had the legacy of colonial defense planning. It was structural, not just strategic.
Absolutely. The defense structure Pakistan inherited from British India was explicitly designed to meet threats from the northwest. It was a land-centric view from the very beginning. Furthermore, the Royal Indian Navy, established in 1928, was always the smallest and weakest of the three services.
It was designed to function purely as a subsidiary force to the powerful Royal British Navy, right?
Yeah.
Which was the ultimate guarantor of maritime security.
That's it. So when partition occurred, Pakistan inherited a smaller, weaker share of what was already the weakest and most neglected service. And even as they slowly expanded their navy post-1947, they continued to follow that British Indian tradition of assigning the navy a subsidiary, low-profile role.
But the real reason for this, let's call it comfortable neglect, was the comfort factor.
In the 1950s and 60s, Britain maintained a strong, dominant presence in the Indian Ocean. Pakistan's strategic calculation was rooted in its alliances.
They were part of collective defense treaties. Let's just clarify what that meant for you listening.
Precisely. Pakistan was allied with Western powers through CETO, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, and CENTO, the Central Treaty Organization, with Britain being a key member of both. The strong British naval presence meant Pakistan had an implicit security guarantee from the sea.
So they were protected by a friendly, preeminent power.
Exactly. This inhibited any urgent need to invest the massive sums required for an active, modern naval role. Why spend scarce resources on a navy when the land threat is immediate and the sea is implicitly protected by your allies? That perception defined the first 20 years of Pakistan's defense policy.
So if the entrenched mindset was land first and the sea is Britain's problem, what were the specific seismic developments in the late 1960s and 1970s that completely shattered this worldview and forced the policy pivot?
The single most important trigger was the fulfillment of the British decision to reduce its East of Suez commitments. This withdrawal, which was finalized by the late 1960s, created a massive, immediate, and irresistible power vacuum across the entire Indian Ocean.
And nature abhors a vacuum, especially a geopolitical one. The U.S. and the Soviet Union rushed in simultaneously, injecting global superpower rivalry directly into the region.
The U.S. was among the first. They moved their nuclear-powered Seventh Fleet into the Indian Ocean as early as December 1963, though their sustained, significant presence really began in 68-69. They quickly sought and enjoyed naval facilities at a number of Allied ports. And crucially, the sources point to the infrastructure development on Diego Garcia.
Diego Garcia. That small, isolated speck of an island just 13 miles long. Why was that so vital?
Location, location, location. And its characteristics, it's roughly 1,000 miles from India, but it provided the U.S. with a critical piece of infrastructure right in the middle of the ocean.
The unsinkable aircraft carrier, as they say.
In a way, yes. Construction began in 1966, was ramped up in the early 1970s, and it developed into a crucial military communication and support facility. It gave the U.S. reach, deep-water harbor access, and a base far removed from politically volatile mainland states, allowing it to sustain a long-term significant naval presence.
And the Soviet counter-response was equally rapid and aggressive.
Oh, indeed. Their first warships entered in 1966. By 1970, the Soviet presence had become reasonably formidable. It shifted from just transient visits to long-term deployments. The sources note 150 Soviet ships visited 26 ports in 16 countries.
And they succeeded in obtaining naval facilities.
They did, notably in places like Aden and initially Berbera, which gave them the necessary logistic support to sustain their own task forces in the region. The peaceful British Lake was now explicitly a high-stakes, nuclear-capable superpower chessboard.
But for Pakistan, the realization wasn't just about these external powers. It was critically about the internal power dynamics and the rise of India as an undeniable regional naval power.
This is the dual threat. India pursued a fascinating and, frankly, effective dual strategy. Publicly, they were vocal critics of the superpower presence, particularly the U.S., arguing for the complete exclusion of outside military forces so that the littoral states could evolve their own security structure. They were championing the zone of peace concept.
But behind that rhetoric, they were aggressively pursuing naval dominance.
Precisely. At the exact same time, India was speeding up its naval modernization to ensure that they became the strongest naval force among all the littoral states. This push was outlined in their five-year defense plans, starting way back in 1964. This program was comprehensive and very aggressive.
What specifically were they acquiring and building that fundamentally changed the regional military balance?
Well, the program included the phased replacement of overage ships, domestic construction of modern frigates, often in collaboration with British firms, and the production of their own survey ships. They acquired sophisticated equipment, guided missiles, radar, submarines, and high-speed gun and torpedo boats.
So they were not just building a coastal defense force.
No, this was a blue water navy they were building.
And this expansion led to a major strategic reorganization aimed at power projection.
It did. India decided to reorganize its navy into two full fleets, one dedicated to the Bay of Bengal and another for the Arabian Sea. This signaled a clear ambition for dominance on both sides of the subcontinent. To support this, they acquired more vessels, and significantly, they developed Goa as an important modern naval base, even securing assistance from Japan for infrastructure development.
This comprehensive effort demonstrated an undeniable desire to play a preponderant role in the Indian Ocean power game, which directly and immediately fed Pakistan's sense of anxiety and strategic vulnerability.
And if the naval expansion was the engine of that anxiety, the Indo-Soviet alignment provided the immediate political context for military action.
Right, this takes us back to the geopolitical maneuvers of the era.
Between 1969 and 1971, the Soviet Union floated its Asian Collective Security Plan, which was broadly viewed as an anti-China arrangement. Pakistan, having painstakingly cultivated bilateral relations with China, refused to participate in any anti-China treaty. They prioritized their long-term strategic relationship with Beijing.
And that decision directly plunged Pakistan into a crisis with the Soviets, accelerating their collaboration with Pakistan's main rival.
Correct. That refusal accelerated the Indo-Soviet collaboration, culminating in the signing of the 1971 Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation. And critically, India invoked that treaty to seek immediate arms, equipment, and diplomatic support from the Soviet Union during the Bangladesh crisis and the subsequent 1971 war.
It confirmed every single one of Pakistan's worst fears. A formal, potent military and diplomatic alignment was now operating directly to Pakistan's severe disadvantage.
And the 1971 war, then, wasn't just a loss of territory. It was a military and naval catastrophe that delivered the final, undeniable lesson about maritime security.
The war exposed Pakistan's vulnerability from the sea in the most dramatic fashion.
Absolutely. The Pakistan Navy's performance was inadequate against the modernizing Indian Navy. The Indian Navy successfully implemented a crippling blockade of East Pakistan, preventing any resupply or reinforcement. More crucially for the future of Pakistan, they inflicted significantly greater losses on Pakistani vessels, even successfully targeting the port of Karachi.
Demonstrating that even the western coast was not safe from a seaborne attack.
The message was brutal. The land-first approach had failed catastrophically because vulnerability from the sea meant that vital supply lines could be cut and many population centers could be attacked.
So this confluence of the British vacuum, the rush of the superpowers, India's explicit dominance ambition, the Indo-Soviet Treaty, and the devastating 1971 losses, it made it absolutely impossible for policymakers to continue ignoring the maritime dimension.
The reorientation was now a matter of national survival. The power arrangements in the Indian Ocean had to be assigned a central, high-priority place in the strategic spectrum.
The shock of 1971 forced those policy planners to recognize the economic and strategic reality of the Indian Ocean. This was the moment the policy moved from reactive to proactive. How did this new strategic priority manifest in the statements and goals of the 1970s?
It was reflected in explicit, high-level statements that recognized the shift. Our sources cite a crucial observation made by the Prime Minister of Pakistan in 1976. He declared, and I'm quoting here, "The mastery of the Indian Ocean, or the freedom of the Indian Ocean, or the control of the Indian Ocean is going to become the most important problem in the future. That will seal the land problem."
That quote is the philosophical pivot point. The assumption had always been that the land problem, Kashmir, the Punjab front, was paramount. Now the Prime Minister is saying the sea will dictate the fate of the land.
It represents a total reversal of strategic priorities. It means that without maritime security and a favorable geopolitical environment in the ocean, all of your investments in land defense could be undermined by a naval blockade or a coastal attack.
So what was the ideal objective stemming from this new maritime focus?
It was defined as seeking a sea of tranquility.
A sea of tranquility. That sounds beautifully diplomatic, but what did it mean in practical terms for Pakistani policy?
The objective was defined as an area free of superpower rivalries, where littoral states were not threatened by any super or regional power, thereby allowing them to focus resources entirely on social and economic uplift. So, nation building instead of military buildup.
That definition immediately highlights the dual nature of Pakistan's anxiety. They're
Mhm.
worried about external powers, the U.S. and the USSR,
Mhm.
but just as much about the internal power dynamics.
Precisely. Pakistan's anxieties stem equally from superpower rivalries and the perceived ambitions of regional states, primarily India, seeking a dominant role or to establish themselves as a regional policeman. Given the checkered history and the high degree of mutual distrust, Pakistan realized that an attempt by a regional power to establish hegemony would be just as dangerous as the superpower rivalries. The goal was a new regime that would not only reduce global military presence, but also guarantee that no state in the region would become a mini superpower, upsetting the local balance of power.
And this objective naturally led Pakistan to become one of the strongest advocates for the Zone of Peace proposal put forward at the UN.
Yes, they were early adopters. Pakistan endorsed Sri Lanka's original proposal back in January 1971. They voted in favor of the UN resolution declaring the Indian Ocean a zone of peace in December of that same year,
Just after the war.
and were made a member of the UN Ad Hoc Committee on the Indian Ocean in December 1972, fully committing to the diplomatic process.
When advocating for this peace zone, what specific, non-negotiable demands did Pakistan insist upon for its implementation?
Pakistan emphasized that all littoral and hinterland states must, first, respect each other's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and second, settle their disputes peacefully. But here is the critical security demand. They must also work toward establishing a modicum of military and nuclear parity amongst themselves.
That phrase, a modicum of military and nuclear parity, that is a direct challenge to the very definition of a sea of tranquility, isn't it?
Yeah.
Isn't demanding parity in the region effectively demanding an arms race in the name of peace? How did the analysts reconcile that contradiction?
That's an excellent question, and it speaks to the raw, practical security calculations involved here. Pakistan's analysts argued that parity was not the desired end state, but a necessary precondition for the peace zone to be implemented safely.
Okay, so precondition.
If there was a massive power imbalance, the larger regional power would have no incentive to agree to restrictions or abide by the peace zone principles. Therefore, reaching a modicum of parity was viewed as defensive deterrence, necessary to check the ambitions of the regional power and force them to the negotiating table on an equal footing.
So for them, it was defensive realism wrapped in diplomatic aspiration.
That's a great way to put it.
And this leads directly to the nuclear challenge, which introduced a terrifying new dimension to security problems for smaller states.
India's peaceful nuclear explosion in May 1974 drastically escalated security problems. Before that, smaller states could hope that if the superpowers withdrew their nuclear arsenal, the immediate nuclear threat would disappear. Now, a regional power possessed the capability. This immediately led Pakistan to perceive this as an established nuclear sword hanging over the region.
So Pakistan's diplomatic response was swift and focused on regional security through international mechanisms.
They immediately put forward the proposal for declaring South Asia a nuclear weapons-free zone, or NWFZ. And this proposal actually won widespread support in the UN because many smaller nations shared the concern over regional nuclearization.
Right.
Pakistan then urged the UN Ad Hoc Committee on the Indian Ocean to fundamentally review its peace zone approach in light of India's nuclear explosion, arguing that the nuclear factor changed the fundamental security landscape of the entire region. The goal was not just to prevent superpowers from bringing their nuclear arsenal, it was to prevent the growth of a regional nuclear monopoly. The sources, however, indicate that despite all these diplomatic efforts, the geopolitical environment only worsened towards the end of the decade, bringing major external shocks that destabilized the Indian Ocean further and rendered the original peace zone goal pretty much unreachable. The period post-1979 was extremely disruptive. First, you have the Iranian Revolution in 78-79, which toppled the Shah, who the U.S. had been actively grooming as the primary regional policeman for the Persian Gulf. This capsized American calculations, destabilized the Gulf, and raised major viability issues for conservative, oil-rich regimes.
And the West interpreted the potential for turmoil as a direct threat to the flow of oil, their core economic interest.
Exactly. And then the ultimate game changer for Pakistan's regional policy, the Soviet military intervention in Afghanistan in December 1979.
Which the Western response was to interpret as a move by the Soviet Union to implement a massive grand design.
Aiming to reach the warm waters of the Indian Ocean and the Gulf oil, potentially through Pakistan or Iran. This was perceived as a direct, unacceptable threat to vital Western interests. The consequence was immediate and severe, an unprecedented escalation of tension.
And we see a rapid increase in naval activity by both superpowers, reaching their greatest strength since the 1973-74 oil embargo, entirely undermining the concept of the zone of peace. This is the moment the Carter Doctrine is launched.
Yes, the Carter Doctrine was a stark warning, declaring that any outside attempt to gain control of the Persian Gulf region will be repelled by use of any means necessary, including military force. The U.S. immediately embarked on creating the Rapid Deployment Force, the RDF, a mobile, flexible projection force designed specifically for Persian Gulf security.
And they frantically sought new military facilities in allied states like Egypt, Oman, Somalia, and Kenya to support this new force structure.
And for Pakistan, the crisis was acute. Soviet troops were on their border in Afghanistan, generating millions of refugees, and the growing superpower naval activity was entirely torpedoing their cherished diplomatic concept of a peace zone. The old policy of immediate exclusion was now completely impractical.
The analysis post-1980 confirms this political realization.
It does. The intense rivalry and the U.S. commitment under the Carter Doctrine made the immediate straight withdrawal of superpowers totally unrealistic. Therefore, Pakistan shifted to a graduated, pragmatic, two-step strategy.
Okay, what was this pragmatic two-step approach?
Step 1. Since immediate exclusion was impossible, Pakistan would temporarily work for a balanced presence of the two superpowers. The reasoning was purely strategic. This balance would prevent either superpower from establishing hegemony, and more importantly, it would check and dissuade ambitious regional powers like India from seeking a preponderant position.
So a necessary, evil-accepting global rivalry to secure regional stability.
That's exactly it. Step 2. Only once that strategic balance had been reached and regional ambitions curtailed could they then realistically work for the total exclusion of outside naval forces and the final implementation of the zone of peace. This graduated two-step approach was recognized by policymakers as the only practical path given the turbulent reality post-1979. The pivot was complete, from ignoring the ocean to managing its geopolitical chaos.
The 1971 war wasn't just a lesson in foreign policy. It revealed critical organizational failures within Pakistan's defense structure. To support this new maritime strategy, a complete overhaul of internal defense coordination was required. What concrete integrated defense reforms were implemented post-1971?
Well, the government realized that the historical autonomy of the three services, Army, Air Force, and Navy, had been detrimental to coordinated action during crises. In 1976, they established a Joint Chiefs of Staff Committee, complete with a permanent chairman and secretariat.
So they realized the services just weren't talking to each other.
Exactly, a total lack of coordination. The express purpose of this committee was to streamline defense planning and promote greater inter-service coordination, ensuring a unified approach to security challenges, including the newly recognized maritime threat.
And there was a highly symbolic move regarding the Navy's headquarters, too.
Yes. To further enhance inter-service coordination and, symbolically, to elevate the Navy's status, the naval headquarters were physically moved from the port city of Karachi to the capital, Islamabad. This placed the Navy's decision-makers right alongside the Army and Air Force leadership.
Ensuring maritime concerns were factored into every top-level defense assessment, effectively achieving parity in the high command structure.
Exactly right.
So, moving to hardware. What specific steps were taken for the Navy's development and modernization, reflecting its new central role in national defense?
The Navy began to develop its capabilities beyond just surface patrols. A crucial development was the establishment of the Navy Air Wing in 1972. This allowed the Navy to operate effectively in three dimensions: surface, subsurface, and air, a necessity for modern naval warfare, especially anti-submarine operations.
And the Navy was also slated to benefit from the major decision in the 1980s to purchase military hardware from the U.S. and other Western countries.
Yes, potentially including things like guided missile destroyers and modern patrol craft, which were necessary to safeguard the newly recognized maritime jurisdiction.
And the rationale for this modernization was now comprehensive, spanning both military survival and economic necessity.
It was no longer just about fighting the next war. A well-equipped navy was deemed necessary for three reasons tied directly to national viability. First, to keep sea lanes open and safe, particularly for shipping oil and essential imports. Second, to protect merchant vessels and fishery ships against harassment, especially within their own jurisdiction.
And third, only then, to defend the country in case war breaks out. The economic argument was paramount.
I mean, it's a matter of economic life support. The sources highlight that 90% of Pakistan's trade relies on sea transportation. Without a navy capable of defending those routes, the country is vulnerable to total economic strangulation, regardless of how strong its land army is.
The 1971 blockade proved this.
It did. Therefore, the Navy transitioned from being a subsidiary fighting force to an economic guarantor.
This new maritime policy also required Pakistan to assert its rights over coastal resources, leading to full support for the concept of the Exclusive Economic Zone, the EEZ.
This was a key policy realization stemming from the UN Law of the Sea discussions. The EEZ is that area between territorial waters and the high seas, extending generally 200 miles from the coastline, where the coastal state has exclusive rights over all living and non-living resources. Pakistan extended full support to this UN concept and decided to declare and enforce its own 200-mile exclusive jurisdiction.
And the financial returns from asserting this economic control were almost immediate, especially in fishery exploitation. This became a significant economic factor for both domestic demand and foreign exchange earnings.
The statistics are astonishing, and they perfectly illustrate the economic urgency of this pivot. The total fish catch in 1974 was 169,102 tons. By 1978-79, that had risen dramatically to 294,000 tons.
A massive increase in utilization.
And even more critically, foreign exchange earnings from fisheries literally quadrupled in just 7 years. They rose from 111.1 million rupees in 1971-72 to 461.79 million rupees in 1978-79.
Wow, a quadrupling of foreign exchange earnings in 7 years, purely from asserting control over their maritime resources. That kind of return alone fully justifies the pivot, regardless of the military threat.
Absolutely. And to sustain this growth and maximize the utilization of these new resources, Pakistan launched a major 4-year project in 1981, costing 30.55 million rupees, in cooperation with the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization, the FAO.
And this was explicitly aimed at creating marine fisheries guidelines and providing scientific information to ensure sustainable, modern exploitation of the resource base.
That's right.
Beyond the fish, the interest in non-living resources also played a role in the renewed focus on the Indian Ocean.
The possibility of discovering offshore oil and valuable seabed minerals was certainly a contributing factor to the increased strategic interest in the waters washing Pakistan's shores. And the policy was clear and firm. Pakistan would not tolerate any foreign power exploring these resources in its exclusive jurisdiction without specific, mutually beneficial arrangements.
So the EEZ was therefore recognized as a vital security and economic shield that required naval enforcement.
It was.
Finally, before we conclude, there was a curious but interesting side note in the academic realm, a political effort to rename the ocean itself to reflect the combined sovereignty of the littoral states.
Yes, this was primarily an academic and diplomatic exercise. A number of scholars in Pakistan advocated changing the name from the Indian Ocean to the Afro-Asian Ocean. The argument was based on undeniable geography.
Which was what?
The combined coastline of African and Asian littoral states and islands was estimated to be 5 times longer than India's approximately 2,000-mile shoreline. Therefore, they argued, Afro-Asian Ocean was a more appropriate, geographically representative, and less politically suggestive name.
That makes a lot of political sense, especially given the sensitivity around regional dominance.
Yeah.
But did the idea gain any traction internationally?
The sources confirm it remained largely an interesting academic and political exercise that did not catch on. Internationally, the ocean continues to be known as the Indian Ocean, which illustrates how deeply entrenched colonial-era nomenclature can be, even when the security dynamics underpinning the name have completely dissolved.
We have journeyed through a dramatic transformation today. What began as a purely land-oriented military focus, depending on the passive security provided by friendly British naval dominance, rapidly transformed into a comprehensive, multi-layered strategic maritime policy by 1981.
The pivot was unavoidable. It was forced by external events that policymakers just could no longer ignore. Pakistan's new outlook centered on 3 critical pillars. National defense, driven by the devastating 1971 war lesson.
Economic resource extraction, focused on the high returns and security of the EEZ.
And international advocacy, championing the diplomatic goal of the peace zone. The policy pivot was a direct result of the power vacuum left by Britain and the subsequent injection of intense superpower rivalry, all occurring while a potent regional naval power emerged on its border.
The core takeaway for you, the learner, is the sheer volatility of national security strategy. National policy is never static. It is fluid, often brutally reactive. External shocks, like the collapse of a key global ally, a major military defeat, the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan, or the discovery of regional nuclear capability, can completely force entrenched national strategies to pivot.
And make a previously ignored dimension like the ocean an unavoidable central security priority. And the 1981 analysis highlights that the desire for a true sea of tranquility requires nearly impossible conditions. The analysts concluded that the goal either demands complete and immediate superpower exclusion, which was ruled out as utopian and impractical after 1979, or maintaining a delicate strategic balance as a necessary, temporary measure to keep ambitious regional powers in check.
So if the conflict was framed then as having no easy solution, we are left with this question that endures today. What does it truly take for a major geopolitical region, one so rich in resources and history, to transition from being an open theater of conflict driven by external and regional ambitions to a guaranteed zone of peace? If the necessity of parity prevents tranquility, does true peace in a contested space only begin when the threat of dominance is completely removed, or when parity is finally achieved and accepted by all players? That's a deep thought to carry with you as you mull over global power dynamics this week.